I cheated with my employee, but he was my husband's friend. Now my husband wants me gone forever.
Hey Redditors, long-time lurker but first-time poster. I've always been a huge fan of Reddit, and it has always been one of my favorite social media, but I never expected that one day I'd be here in Reddit posting and asking for advice. I guess life isn't always what you expect. I am currently in such a shitty position, I don't even know what to do. I am distraught. I am hoping that by posting here, I'll get reasonable advice on what to do next, or some semblance of peace, since I've always been told that talking about your problems helps them. I cheated on my husband with his best friend, and I currently do not know how to go about appeasing him. I am in such a bad place. I know what I did was wrong, but for the sake of our marriage, I need him to forgive me. If my husband doesn't not forgive me, then I am literally ruined. I know you're probably wondering what happened, so backstory first. I am Arya, a 28 female, and my husband Jimin, a 29 male, have been married for 2 years, and we live in California in the United States of America. We met at a summer music festival. We both liked the same indie band playing on the main stage, so we ended up dancing together in the crowd. We connected, and I even remember joking that he shared a name with the popular singer Jimin from BTS, which made him laugh. It was as if something clicked between us. We shared dreams and made promises, and Jimin became my rock. He was such a sweet and caring guy and didn't care that I was so out of his league. For context, so you understand where I'm coming from, my husband Jimin is a chaebol. For those that don't know what a chaebol is a very large South Korean family-owned conglomerate, so basically large families-owned companies. The kids of those families are called chaebols, and they are called this because they are very rich. And I don't mean regular rich, I mean the 1% rich, the top untouchable rich. These few families are like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates of South Korea, and that's the kind of family my husband came from. I, on the other hand, grew up on the bad side of town in the US and lived on food stamps. So yes, me and my husband came from 2 different worlds. I was so surprised when he proposed to me within a year of dating and then introduced me to his family. Of course, his family did not like me. To them, I was from the wrong race, wrong nationality, and poor. What could their son want from me? Chaebols have a strict rule of marrying from other influential families, so they couldn't believe my husband wanted me. Trust me, it was something that stunned me, lol. I had always thought stuff like this only existed in. So I was really surprised to find out the power hierarchy. Stuff was real. My husband had to give me a quick rerun of everything to know about chaebols and Korea and stuff to do and not do. So it was really disheartening when they didn't like me. They said I was a gold digger and tried to convince my husband, but of course my husband didn't listen. And in a few months we were married. To quell my husband's family's fear, I suggested signing a prenup. And even though my husband disagreed, he finally caved in when I insisted and made me sign a prenup. The marriage went smoothly. It was a very small wedding at a small church, and we invited just a few friends and family members. I didn't want something large because I hated being around crowds, and he respected that. I remember telling him the words, "I do." To be honest, I was scared of getting married because I didn't want it to hold me down. But eventually I summoned up the courage because I loved my husband. Like I said before, my husband was from a very rich family. In fact, he was the next in line heir to be CEO until he stepped down for his younger brother. I remember it caused a huge falling out in his family because my husband was my father-in-law's choice to be CEO. My father-in-law could not understand why my husband would turn down being CEO, but my husband said he didn't really want the stress that came with that, plus the fact that we would have to move back to South Korea and have to travel a lot. He just didn't want that stress. So my husband became a bit of a part-time teacher. He only went to work on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Fridays, so Wednesdays and Thursdays were his days off during the weekdays. While it was hilarious, I know you're probably shocked. I found it hilarious too. My husband was a second-generation heir to one of the biggest countries in South Korea. So how does one go from that to becoming a common part-time teacher? But the thing is, my husband has always been humble, and it didn't really bother him. He didn't care what his status was and didn't want to be bored at home, so he took the job. That didn't stop his family from mocking him, lol. They mocked him for weeks as they found it hilarious and insulting to their family name. Because of my husband's family's wealth, I also didn't need to work. but I didn't want to be a stay-at-home wife as I thought that would be too boring. So I decided to pursue my passion, which was hairstyling. I was very good at it and decided to operate my own store, which Jimin bought for me. Within a few weeks of opening my store, I decided I needed to get serious. And I mean serious. I was seriously making money there because I was really good at hairstyling, and I didn't have much competition. So I decided to give my store an upgrade. Of course, Jimin had no qualms giving me money for that. I had a full-on remake of my store and got a receptionist and some other hairstylists, so it wouldn't just be me in the store, and we'd attend to customers quicker. And within months, I knew I made the right decision. Business was booming, so I hired even more stylists. I was now more management and less hands-on at the job because I had a lot of stylists working for me. One day, someone came into the store to look for me. He didn't have an appointment and didn't sound like someone I knew at all. But I wasn't busy, so I told the receptionist to let him in. The moment he came in, I was surprised. He was really handsome, and I mean it. My husband, Jimin, is very handsome, tall, pale skin, and long hair, but there was something about this guy that just really drew me in like a forbidden fruit. He introduced himself and told me his name was Minjun, but that I could call him by his English name, Michael. He was Korean, just like my husband. It was something I thought was interesting at that moment, but didn't give much thought to it until I later found out he was my husband's best friend. He said he was looking for a job as a hairstylist. I was honestly taken aback at first because nothing about this guy screamed stylist, but I had always learned to never judge a book by its cover, so I decided to give him a chance. I let him try his hands on a dummy, and I was astounded. He was good, like really good, amazing even. I wasn't really looking for a stylist then because I had enough stylists at the store, but Michael's skills were just too good to pass on, so I employed him. He fit in like a perfect glove. Everybody loved Michiel. He was funny, handsome, charming. In fact, he was perfect. The customers loved him because he was exceptionally skilled and really handsome. In fact, a lot of them would refuse to be worked on by any stylist except Michiel Lol. Some would even wait till he was free if they came and he was busy. The other co-workers, stylists, on the other hand, loved him because he was so handsome, nice, and patient with them, even the ones that weren't officially stylists but were going through training or something. Few months in, though, and I realized there was something about Michael. He was just different. Michael had a lot of passion for the job, but it was obvious he had never worked a day in his life before, at least to me. As someone who grew up in the slums and lived on food stamps, it was pretty easy to pick out a person that had never known suffering in his life, and Michiel was that person. He did not carry himself like someone that needed to work. He carried himself like someone that wanted to work. And I know you might be wondering, oh, what do you mean by that? You don't know what you're saying. But just hear me out. There's a certain way that a person carries themselves that you just know that they're different. I'm guessing I noticed it because Michael carried himself the same way my husband carries himself, like he was on a whole different level from everybody. No, they weren't proud. My husband was definitely the most humble and kindest person I knew, and Michiel too was definitely not proud, but they were just different. They stood out from the crowd in a good way. It was something I also mentioned to my husband after our first date about how the way he carried himself was different. My husband was amused LOL, but told me that chaebols were usually taught to be well-rounded in all areas from birth, and maybe it was that. Besides, those weren't the only things I noticed about Michiel. I also noticed the kind of clothes he wore. They were very expensive, lol, and also the cars he drove. Everyone in the store thought Michiel didn't have a car, but what they didn't know was that he actually had a driver that always dropped him a few blocks away from the store in the morning and waited right at that spot to pick him up when he closed. I had only noticed it by chance when I came very early to work a few times. Michiel was always very early to work. In fact, he was usually the first to arrive, and usually also the last to leave. I had noticed that it was the same person every time, so it couldn't be an Uber, and also, the cars the driver drove were very expensive. Initially, I had thought that maybe the driver was Michael's boyfriend or husband, but I had to dismiss that train of thoughts because Michael himself one time during discussions in the store admitted that he was straight and single, and also, I noticed the interactions between the driver and Michiel were too sparsy and dry for them to be together. I know this sounds like I'm invested in Michiel lol, but I was actually intrigued. He was like a puzzle, difficult to unravel. In fact, he was an enigma, if you would call him that. During all these puzzling, Michael and I started to grow closer. We had a lot in common. We both loved hairstyling, and we were very good at it. We loved movies and art, and we had a ton of other stuff that we had in common. I am naturally a very introverted and shy person, but Michael just made speaking easy and effortless. With him, I felt like I could truly be myself. Maybe that should have been the first red flag in my head, but back then, I just didn't care. I had always grown up thinking people didn't like me and even had some abandonment issues. So when someone very attractive, apart from my husband, started showing me attention, I gobbled it up. One day, I remember it being a Wednesday. I had forgotten my laptop at home, and since it was my husband's day off, he brought it to the store for me. The receptionist and everyone knows him there, so he doesn't get stopped at the receptionist's desk or anything. So imagine my surprise when I, in my office, heard my husband happily say someone's name like Minjun Wo. At first, I wondered who Minjun was and if he was a customer before remembering that Mikhail was Minjun, and he had told me that when he came to apply for a job. I got up from my desk and went to look because I was curious. There was my husband hugging Mikhail, so they knew each other, and from the way they were hugging, they seemed pretty close. We went into my office so as not to cause a ruckus for customers getting their hair done, and my husband then introduced Mikhail as his best friend and a chibol, and that was when it clicked. Now I knew why I was so curious about him, why I was so intrigued. He was a chibol. His family was very rich. That was when I realized why I thought he was so similar to my husband. At first I was stunned, then amused. Why was someone from a family that owned one of the biggest companies in South Korea working as a stylist in my store? Lol. Of course I questioned Mikhail about it, to which he told me. He had been bored and had always liked styling hairs, hence why he applied. He was also trying to show his family that hairstyling wasn't a fool's errand, hence why he was working. His family held the belief that hairstyling wasn't something he should bother himself with, since he would inherit the company someday, but he had always loved hairstyling. I also found out from my husband that Michael was currently in America because he was refusing to go back home to Korea. I also questioned another thing. Why wasn't Michael at our wedding? My husband said Mikhail was his best friend, but he had never told me about him, nor did I see him at the wedding. My husband, however, explained that that was because he and Mikhail had been going through a rough patch then and weren't in touch. Remember the rules I told you guys about chibols marrying other chibols and influential families? Well, apparently everyone had assumed lol, even though they weren't dating, that my husband would marry Michael's sister to merge the two families together because they were so similar in status and that it would be good for business. So they were appalled when my husband had brought me along and said he was going to marry me. Hence, another reason why they didn't approve of our marriage. Also, Michael's sister had a crush on my husband, so she was really crushed that my husband had married someone else. And that's why Mikhail had gotten angry at my husband, and they had a falling out until a few months ago when Mikhail finally reached out and apologized. I was really stunned and also questioned about why my husband didn't tell me about it. But my husband said during that time, he didn't think it was necessary, and the thing really put him in a bad mood. Then, so he didn't want to talk about it. I kind of understood him as I can really relate to not wanting to talk about something that brings bad memories, and I let it go. But it really brought us closer. Michael told me all about the embarrassing things my husband did in childhood, Lowell, and all the things I didn't know about him. My husband is not a secretive person by any means and is very open with me, but Michael has known him since childhood, so there was a lot of stuff that he knew, Lowell. It brought us closer, and soon we were hanging out solo. Sometimes we would go watch a movie or go to an art gallery to see an exhibition, stuff like that. I started getting excited to go to work in the morning because I knew Michael was usually the first one there, and we would talk and relate before the others would come. And I also didn't leave as early as I used to from work because I knew Michael was usually the last to leave, and we would also chat and have fun. Sometimes we would go out for breakfast in the morning before anyone came, or we would go out for dinner in the evening. I guess that was when I started falling for him. I should have known he was a liar, but he just looked too innocent. He was also just too charming for my own good. The second red flag that should have gone off in my head was the fact that his sister was supposed to marry my husband. But I overlooked that, since I thought he was already over it since he reached out to my husband to apologize. Another red flag that I should have also noticed going off in my head was the fact that he insisted on hanging out with me without my husband present. Honestly, I noticed everything, even when he flirted with me and I flirted back. But I was just so flattered that somebody actually wanted me that I didn't even notice the foolish hole I was digging myself into. That was why I didn't resist when he first kissed me. I recoiled at first and thought of my husband, but Michel convinced me that my husband would never know, and so I fell into his honeyed traps. We started having a secret affair. The mornings before everyone would come in for work that we used to talk and go out for breakfast were now times we would be intimate. Sometimes we would also wait before everyone left, before becoming intimate. We were like two stupid rabbits. Sometimes I would tell my husband I had to walk overtime at work, just so I could stay with Michael. Or sometimes while my husband was at work, I would go over to the house with Michael. I think about a week ago or something, my father-in-law fell sick. It was bad, or so they said. My husband knew that he had to fly back to South Korea because he knew that there would be a crazy power tussle in the family and company if my father-in-law, who was the current CEO, died. They didn't give us specifics about what was wrong with my father-in-law except from telling us it was bad and that he was in the hospital. My husband wanted to fly back with me, but I refused because frankly his family didn't like me. So why bother, and also how would I keep up my affair with Michael if I was in South Korea? So I used my business as an excuse and told him I didn't trust my workers enough to leave them on their own for the time that we would be in South Korea. Of course, my husband was very disappointed, but he decided to leave me and flew back alone. I was ecstatic. Yes, I know I'm disgusting and a vile cheater. How could I be ecstatic that my husband traveled to see my ill father-in-law? But honestly, I feel like that time there was a veil hanging over my eyes. It was as if I wasn't the one doing those actions. Now I regret it, and if I could go back in time, I would not make the same mistakes either way. During that period, Michel and I started using I and my husband's house as our meeting point. We started meeting up regularly at the house since my husband was away. Of course, I called my husband regularly and asked for updates so as not to seem callous and be a caring wife. My husband said he didn't think my father-in-law's illness was as bad as they made it seem, and that he didn't think he was dying anything soon, but that he would stay for a while just to be sure. I was gladdened by that, of course. In as much as the fact that my father-in-law did not like me, he was still my husband's father, and him dying now would disorganize a lot of things. Either way, Michael and I continued using I and my husband's house as our meeting point, and because I was getting regular updates from my husband, I really did not think he was coming anything soon. Oh, how I was so wrong. Yesterday, Michael and I decided to meet up at the house, as we regularly did since my husband left. We jumped on each other as soon as we got into the house and began getting intimate. We hadn't even really gone far when I heard the door to the bedroom open and in walked my husband with a luggage in his hands. I was stunned. I never heard the front door opening or the gate or anything of that sort, so I was really shocked. I was so invested in being intimate with Michel and didn't even think my husband was coming today that I hadn't even thought to listen for any noises, hence why I never heard anything. Cue me rushing to cover myself with the bed sheets and Michael lazily picking his clothes and putting it on. Yes, I mean, lazily. He wasn't rushing, which would be the normal response in a situation like this. In fact, he had a stupid grin on his face. And I remember wondering why he was smiling, but I was too bothered by my husband's silence to even care. Michael put on his clothes and left. My husband was still standing by the door. He looked so surprised. It was obvious he was not expecting this at all. He was silent for a while, and then he went crazy, and I mean crazy. He started silently screaming. You know the kind of screaming where the person is obviously screaming, but there's no sound coming out from their mouth. He destroyed everything in the house, and I mean everything. All the expensive artworks, expensive items I collected, mirrors, everything went down, and then he just sat down and looked so defeated. I feel so guilty. My husband is the calmest person I know, so realizing I pushed him to this state makes me feel guilty. He has left the house now, and I do not know what to do. I am so scared I feel like my marriage is over, and I destroyed it myself. What do I do? Apart from the mayhem he evoked in the house, he did not say a word or even look at me. I honestly need your advice. Please help. Update. Hello, Reddit. It's been a while. About a month to be exact. I honestly said I wasn't going to post on here again because back then when I made that post, I was honestly looking for advice and just needed someone to talk to. Either way, a lot of people have been coming to my DMs asking for updates and wanting to know what happened. So here's everything that has gone down since. First of all, my husband, or should I say ex-husband, and I are getting a divorce. No dramatics, no long story. He doesn't want to work on the marriage, doesn't want counseling, just a divorce. He feels like I've ultimately betrayed him and that there's no coming back from this. He has presented me with divorce papers to sign, and I know that I do not have a good case in court. I might not even get a settlement. First of all, we had a prenuptial agreement in place. Second of all, we do not even have any children together as we decided that we weren't ready yet, so I can't file for child support. Third, he has evidence of me cheating. Yes, I was as shocked as you are when I found out. My husband knew, and he found out through the good old-fashioned way that a lot of people have been caught through texts. He found out through my text messages, but he didn't know who I was cheating on him with, and he really wanted to find out, hence why he waited and didn't confront me. And yes, the red flags that went off in my head were right. Michael was the devil himself. Michael only got with me to destroy my marriage, and I'm not even joking or being dramatic here. He told me this himself, apparently. My husband wanted to surprise me with his presence, so he had texted Michael earlier that day and asked him if I was at the store, to which Michael had said yes, even though Michael knew that we would be at home. He had set it up so my husband would come home and meet us at home, and he had been right. My husband had come home to drop off his luggage before coming to the store to surprise me, and had met the shock of his life. As to why Michael did it, he told me he only did it because he was curious as to why my husband would pick me over his sister. Now that my husband has finally seen my true colors, he will go back to his sister. My husband had really been enraged on finding out that the person I had been cheating on him with had been his best friend, and that was why he went on such a crazy spree around the house. He said he had expected anyone but Michael. Also, because of the prenuptial agreement in place, I won't be getting much money even if I was to get a settlement. Here's why: after my husband stepped down from being heir, his main source of income became his teaching job, because my husband refused to become CEO after my father-in-law. My father-in-law wanted to cut my husband off, but my mother-in-law refused and still funded my husband. My husband also had a hefty trust fund in place, so even if my mother-in-law hadn't funded him, my husband still wouldn't have gone broke. Knowing how smart my husband is, I'm sure he has already transferred every single fund he got from his mother back to her, and also the trust fund is something he had before we got married, so I won't be getting any access to that. Then again, this is all speculation, as I honestly don't know for sure. We'll be meeting in court soon, and then I'll know. In the meantime, I guess I'm going to arm myself with a lawyer because I am no expert on legal matters. Safe to see I've ruined my entire marriage and I am solely to blame. I just wish my husband had chosen to work on our marriage instead of a divorce. I am not a saint. I have my fair share of flaws and I have done my husband wrong. But I mean, we should have sat down as adults and discussed everything and not act irrational like he did. We should have tried counseling. Did I also mention my husband has sold the store he bought for me? Yes, he did, and now I have no source of income. I'm back to square one. And do you know what hurts the most? It's the fact that I'm the only one taking the blame and the fall. Despite the fact that Michael seduced me, he's getting no blame. He has gone back to South Korea, and his life is just peachy. I'll probably go broke after this and have to pick myself up right from square one again. But Michael will get no consequence at all. I still hope that one day, though, that karma comes for him. Also, the fact that I proved my in-laws right also hurts. I know they are probably throwing a feast and telling my husband how they were right. Well, I hope someone learns from my situation and mistakes. Thanks for listening, honestly. You know, when you are married to someone who is always busy to even give you attention for a minute, or notice and appreciate everything you do, is hard. Sometimes you ask yourself why you get married, or how it would have been if you didn't get married. Not to your husband only, but how it would have been if you were not married at all. I just don't understand people who change after they get married. I mean, my husband, or must I say my ex-husband, was giving me so much love and attention before we got married. But after like a year into our marriage, he changed to be someone that I don't even know. It's more like I got a false advertisement of him. Lack of emotional connection and support in a marriage can lead you to try to find that connection elsewhere. I loved my husband dearly, but I just felt unappreciated and misunderstood in our marriage. As the years went by, he seemed to give me less and less attention. I started to wonder if I made the right decision marrying him. Every year, I thought he was going to change. We were emotionally distant while in the same place. He didn't look at me the same way he usually did. I tried to even change the way I looked, went to the gym, and even bought myself some new clothes so he could notice me. I would sometimes ask myself if he didn't find me attractive anymore, or maybe he had found someone else better than me. But why not divorce me or tell me straight in the face that you have lost attraction, or you no longer feel me anymore because stringing a person along, while you know that you no longer feel them or love them anymore, hurts more than receiving divorce papers or breakups and not getting any explanation for the separation. I don't know if you understand what I mean. Please help me understand why men do this to us, but get angry when we do it to them. So I, 33, met my husband, 42, on a plane coming back to California from London. He was sitting beside me, and we had a long conversation. It was lovely. Well, I had gone to London to attend my sister's wedding. Martin was a very smart, handsome, and funny man to be around. You know, when you just connect with someone on the first day of seeing or meeting them, that was me and Martin. We just clicked, you know. We had a lot in common and our goals collided. He was that missing piece I've been looking for all those years. We became friends. He would tell me a lot about his future plans and what kind of a woman he wanted in his life. Well, he had lost his wife a couple of years ago, and he found it really hard to move on because he looked for his wife in every woman he met. So he stayed single for 2 full years. We started dating after 3 months of being friends and spending more time together. And every moment was never a dull moment. It was great. He used to fulfill my desires and give me everything I needed from a man. He supported, and most of all, he understood. We got married after a year into our relationship. I wish I knew what happened to my husband that made him so disconnected. You know, before we got married, or let me say before we officialized our relationship, he used to tell me how much he appreciated me. His late wife was his everything, and he felt like he had lost one of his body cells when she passed on. He felt alone and somehow like he was lost without her. Then I came into his life and changed all that. He became the person he was when he was still with his wife, and that he felt so much alive and carefree again. Yes, his late wife would bring a good and happy side of him, but I was giving him more. I was charmed. Well, that was really charming. And then we started dating. I mean, he was also everything I needed in a man, and he was very understanding and loving. So I thought I had found the one, the love of my life. But I guess I was wrong. I loved my husband very much. Well, more like I still love him, but, you know, sometimes love alone is not enough. I'm not a woman who would cheat on her husband, but the way he had distanced himself from me, it made me feel like we were somehow losing connection. After a year and a half on our marriage, Martin started going out a lot. He would say he was going on a business trip, or if he was around, he would just focus on his work or go out with his associates and friends. I would be left alone in the house, all bored and lonely. Despite my efforts to communicate with Martin and express my feelings, he seemed to be too caught up in his own world to listen. I felt like I was living with a stranger, and the love and connection we once shared had vanished. I had been so patient with him, thinking he would change and become the person he was before he got married, you know. I had that hope because I would address the issue to him and would just apologize and promise to change. But after some time and years of not getting attention from my husband, I got tired of being an understanding and patient woman. So I started seeking that attention elsewhere, where I felt wanted and appreciated. One weekend, a friend of mine hosted a party, and that was where I met him, the man I cheated with. He was charming and handsome. He introduced himself as George Jackson. He was really funny, and he knew how to make a person forget their problems. From that moment we met, there was undeniable chemistry between us. He made me forget that I had a very huge and depressing problem in my house. My husband was depressing me to a point that I was sleeping with wine every night. George and I talked for hours, and I felt more alive than I had ever been in years. George was attentive and complimentary, showering me with affection. He understood a woman's needs and desires. You know, he made me feel like I was a woman again and that I was not the problem. It was a lot, and I was drowning. As we were talking and laughing, George started telling me sweet things that would make any woman melt. But then I remembered that I was actually a married woman. We spoke more about ourselves. I even mentioned the problems I was facing in my marriage. He was kind and understanding, and he listened to me without judgment. He offered me a shoulder to cry on and a sympathetic ear, something that Martin had failed to do. Over time, George and I became close friends, and I found myself confiding in him more and more. He was always there for me, and he made me feel seen and heard in a way that Martin had not for years. So we started hanging out as friends, of course. As the months passed, my friendship with George grew stronger, and we started to develop feelings for each other. We began an affair, and I found myself feeling alive and desired for the first time in years. He had that dopamine over me that I was missing, and every moment with him was magical. I loved my husband, but this newfound excitement and admiration was intoxicating. I knew I shouldn't have done this, but the thrill of being desired by someone new was hard to resist. It felt like I was living in another dimension, you know. It was really refreshing. The way Martin didn't pay attention to me, he didn't even notice what was happening in front of his eyes. I had thought he was going to notice some changes in me, or the way I was always out. I was no longer spending much time in the house, especially during weekends. I was always out with either George or by myself. That was how ignorant he was. I would always wonder what was happening in his head. But I got tired of being concerned. It was really hurting me that my husband was treating me the way he was treating me. We became more like housemates who share a bedroom and not husband and wife. I needed his time, attention, and affection, but he was too busy for that. I once had thoughts of him cheating on me or performing adultery on our marriage because of the way he was acting. What was hurting the most was that someone else was giving me the attention I had always longed for, the time I needed and affection, and it was not my husband. George was giving me an adrenaline rush, and he was making me happy. Putting a smile on my face and thinking about him would make me giggle. I don't even remember when was the last time I had felt like that. I was sure that even my soul had a dust of sorrows because I was no longer happy with my husband. George had that effect on me that I couldn't even explain, but it was there. You know, sometimes when my day wasn't a great day, if he didn't call or if I didn't see him at our secret spot, he surely knew what I've been missing. Was I too attached to George? Well, I think I was. One evening, George suggested we sneak away for a romantic getaway together. Martin had not been home for a couple of days. Well, it was more like he would come back from wherever he was very late, and I would be long asleep, then leave very early around 6 in the morning, and I would still be sleeping. I had never been on a real vacation with my husband, besides on our honeymoon, which was cut short by an emergency that needed him at work. And the thought of escaping my mundane life for a weekend with George was enticing. I had to come up with an excuse to leave the house, so I texted Martin and told him that I was going out with friends for a weekend getaway. George booked a room at a hotel in the city just a few hours away. When we arrived at the hotel, he took my hand and led me to our room. He pulled me close and kissed me passionately. The moment was electric, and I melted into his embrace. I felt really great to feel someone giving you such attention. I couldn't even remember the day I last had an intimate moment with a male person or my husband. He would always come back tired to even touch me. The only thing he managed to do was giving me a perk when he came back from work or going, and that was it. So it was actually a very good feeling, an escape for me. George and I spent the entire weekend exploring the city and getting to know each other better. George showered me with compliments and made me feel like the most desirable woman in the world. It felt so right at that moment, like there was nothing wrong. My weekend with George was what I had really needed. It was truly therapeutic for me. So as we were exploring the city, George had suggested that we go to the beach. Since it was hot, so the weather allowed, we went to the beach. He then asked me to swim with him. I was a bit hesitant at first, but he begged me, and I couldn't resist his begging, sexy eyes. So I eventually agreed, so we swam together. As we were swimming together in the ocean, I felt a rush of excitement and guilt. I knew that what I was doing was wrong, but I just couldn't help myself. I was tired of feeling ignored and unappreciated by my husband, and this handsome George guy was making me feel alive again. After the swim, George and I went back to the hotel room and spent the night together. It was a passionate and intense encounter, and I felt like I had finally found the attention and affection I had been missing from my husband. George was so gentle with me. He appreciated and complimented my body in a way that I felt like living my true self. He took me to another planet. I was feeling all sorts of tingles and butterflies inside me. As our weekend together came to an end, I knew I had crossed a line. I was falling for George, but I also loved my husband. I felt guilty about what I had done and wondered if I should confess everything to him or not. But confessing was going to ruin a lot of things and destroy my marriage. It was like I was stuck between a rock and a very hard place, and I didn't even know how to get out of the situation. As much as I loved my husband, but sometimes I find myself feeling particularly lonely and unappreciated. So one summer day, it was my husband's 42nd birthday, so I had decided that I would throw a party for him. Not just because he was turning 42, but I wanted him to focus on one thing. That time, George had gone to visit his family in Washington, D.C., so I had no one who was going to give me any attention, even though he would call to check up on me. So I wanted to make my husband at least pay attention to me and rethink about our marriage because I had that feeling that said it was over. Because of the way he was never home, nor giving me attention. I had invited his friends, family, and associates for his surprise 42nd birthday party. So I was busy preparing for my husband's birthday party. I had planned everything, from all of his favorite foods and decorations. Yes, I was feeling about what I was doing with George, but I also needed my husband's time and attention, so the party was going to give me that, even if it was for a day. I was somehow anxious and so excited to see the look on his face when he walked into the living room and saw all of his friends, associates, and family gathered there, waiting to celebrate him. Later on, he came back and was pretty much surprised. I was happy to see that surprised look on his face, and it was exactly what I had been hoping for. I saw it on his face that he was happy, even though I was not. The party went well, but I was bored and missing George. Martin was busy with his friends and associates. He didn't even come to say thank you for the surprise party. I felt so unappreciated and unnoticed. Later on, people left and I went to put on my sexy number, lingerie, to bring back the spark and love in our marriage. And guess what happened? He came to the bedroom, went to take a shower, then he slept. He even snored. It was really heartbreaking because I was trying to fix my marriage so that I would forget about what I was doing with George, but my husband was not even getting the hints of everything I did or was trying to do. I had hoped that he would at least notice every effort that I was putting on our marriage, but I guess I was in it alone. The following morning, I made sure to wake up early so that I would catch him before he left for work. Luckily, I found him not even dressed. He didn't look like a person who was going to work, so I asked him to give me a moment with him because we needed to talk. I was shocked when he agreed to have the talk with me, because in my mind I had already told myself that he was going to make an excuse so that he would avoid the talk I wanted to do. So as we were talking, I told him everything that had been hurting me in our marriage and how much he never gave me any attention or affection. He told me lots of excuses, telling me that the reason he was busy was because he was trying to grow his business for our future, and that he didn't want his children to suffer when he passed on, so he had to secure their future legacy. I just didn't believe his lame and lousy excuse because we didn't even have children, and yet he was talking about our children's future legacy. I mean, how we were even going to make children if he was the kind of person he was. I am sure that if we had children, they were going to suffer like I was. They were not going to get his attention like I was. So somehow I thanked God that he didn't bless us with any children. If he was still the Martin that I had met on a plane back from London, then I would have said that he would be a great father because he was a great boyfriend and life partner at that time. Until he was not, and that happened after we had been married for a year and some months. We talked and he apologized, promising me that he would change and would try to be a better husband. There was progress, right? That day we had spent the day together, watching movies and doing lots of lovemaking during the day. He then told me to get ready because we were going out. Wasn't I the happiest woman? I was over the moon. I had thought that my man was finally back. That day, I managed to forget about George and enjoy the moment with my husband. Later on, we went out to have dinner, and it was really great going out with him. I had missed my husband a lot. Days passed. He was the loving, caring, affectionate, and funny Martin that I had fallen in love with. We made lots and lots of love. George had tried calling several times, but I had put my phone on silent because I didn't want any disturbance when spending time with my husband after a long time of trying to get his attention. He had also started noticing me, complimenting, giving me his time and attention. The guilt was there because I knew that deep down, if my husband was to find out about my abomination with George, my efforts would have gone to waste. A lot would be ruined, so I prayed that he does not find out. About 2 months later, I found out that I was pregnant. I was shocked and somehow happy because it was obvious that the child was my husband's, forgetting that I had slept with George also about a week before I fixed things with my husband. I told my husband about the pregnancy, and he was ecstatic. I had never seen my husband that happy in a very long time, and it made my heart at peace. I had broken things off with George because I had fixed things with my husband, and I didn't want any destruction in the process of fixing my marriage with Martin. As expected, George was angry. Well, angry was a small definition of how he was. I can say he was furious because after I had broken things off with him, he threw tantrums and insults at me, telling me that I had led him on. Then I was dumping him like a used toilet paper just because my husband had decided to come back to his senses. I didn't understand his anger because in whatever that we were doing, we had never titled it or officialized any relationship going on between us. It was just friends who also helped each other in one another's desires. Yes, I had caught some feelings, I won't lie on that, but then it was not feelings of love, but it was feelings of lust, so I didn't really understand his outburst. Maybe I might have led him on, but that didn't give him the authority to call me names just because I had fixed things with my husband. Was I wrong to do that? Was it unfair? So as months passed, my tummy was growing. My marriage was where I had wanted it to be. My husband was back, showering me with so much love and attention. I enjoyed and loved every moment of it. On the other hand, George was becoming a bee in the ear. He was threatening me a lot. I tried ignoring him, but he was persistent about exposing our little affair and telling my husband what had been happening behind his back. Another side of me was scared because I didn't understand the sudden obsession he had over me, while the other side wanted to just hire a hitman and finish him because he was not just threatening me, but also my marriage. During those months, I remember it very well, I was going with my husband to do baby shopping. We bumped into George, and an unexpected thing happened. George greeted us. Him and my husband looked like they had known each other for quite some time, the way they were talking to each other. I was so uncomfortable and prayed that George does not spill the beans to Martin because if he did, my marriage would be over. Martin introduced George as his business partner. Mind you, I had never met or knew any of his business partners, so it came as a shock to me. About a year later, I had already given birth to a very handsome baby boy, but a strange thing happened. The baby looked like George. My husband didn't notice at first because he had always wanted to have a child, but because of his busy schedule, he didn't have time, his words not mine. That time, I had already known that George was the father of the child, but I couldn't burst my husband's happy bubbles and ruin my marriage because of George, so I kept everything a secret. Months passed, my husband went back to his old absent self, and he would come home late and go to work very early. I didn't understand what was going on with him because if I asked him, he would be closed off and say it was just work. That really took me back to missing George, but I would remember that he was Martin's business partner, so if I were to go back to him, it would be too risky. So it was just me and my son. I felt like my marriage had finally come an end. You know, when you have that feeling that notifies you that something is wrong, and it is the end of everything. That was what I felt like. There was something big coming and I won't be able to survive it. So one day I had posted my baby boy on social media, and it didn't even take 5 minutes to receive a call from George shouting at me, threatening me and asking me why I hid his child from him. I didn't understand the sudden anger he had, so I denied the child being his, even though deep down I knew that the baby was his, and there was pure and solid evidence. My son didn't even need any DNA to prove that he was George's son. In my heart, I wanted and wished it was not his child but Martin's, but I guess what happens in the dark always finds its way to the light. George had gone from being obsessive over me to wanting his child, or else he was going to tell my husband. I was stuck in a very difficult and tight position because Martin was happy that the child was his. Even though he had suddenly changed and became the cagey and distant Martin, the only person he paid attention to, even though it would be for a few minutes, was our son. I once had a feeling that maybe his behavior was caused by George. Maybe George had told him about our affair, and whenever I would think about it, it would bring shivers down my spine. I didn't want my husband finding out about my abomination with George, but the way things were happening, there were a lot of possibilities that it might come out anytime, and it was not going to be nice. A lot would be destroyed. My conscience was not at peace, as the thoughts of losing my husband were always popping up in my head. The tension that was happening in my house was slowly affecting my child, because I would sometimes neglect him and drink my wine. I even opted to find him a nanny, which was very helpful because I was not fit enough to mother my baby. The guilt was eating me up, the regrets I was feeling. I wished I could take back the hands of time and undo everything. I wished I could reverse the cheating and get pregnant for George. On the other hand, George was adding another problem to the problems I had. So one night, Martin came back from work early, and he asked to speak with me in our bedroom. I had a little hope that maybe he wanted us to talk about our marriage and find a solution to whatever that was going on and work on it, only to be asked if there was something I wanted to tell him. I first didn't understand what his question was referring to, so I told him that I didn't understand what he was saying. I saw it in his face that he was trying to hide his anger, but because I knew my husband, I knew that he was angry and wouldn't just ask me if there was something I had wanted to tell him. I meant only one thing, that either George told him about the baby and our affair, or he had found out all by himself. As we were still talking, he asked me if I knew what I wanted. Again, I was so lost, so he proceeded by dropping a huge bomb at me. He told me that he had been thinking of giving me space and time to think about what I had wanted and be able to tell him whatever I was hiding. So he gave me a week to come clean with everything before he finds out himself. I knew there and then that I had to clean up my chest and tell him everything. But stupid me, I decided to just lie and mix the story. I was scared and didn't want to lose my husband, so I told him that I had kissed a stranger in the club because I was going through a lot and he was not there. I saw it in his face that he didn't believe me, so he told me that he would be moving out and he would be back once I was ready to tell him everything, and he was giving me a week to do that. I was shaking in my boots because I had thought I asked George to keep everything a secret until I had figured something out regarding the child. Well, I guess he didn't listen and ran to tell Martin everything. Now my marriage is over because of his obsession and big mouth. George ruined my marriage, and I knew that there was nothing I could do to save it. The damage was too major. Martin moved out of the house, and I felt like he took a piece of my heart with him. That night I cried until I couldn't anymore. So I resorted to wine, which I had thought was going to help me, at least, to be able to sleep. Instead, I kept having flashbacks of my moments with Martin, our happy moments till the time he started changing, and I resorted to cheating because I didn't have my husband's attention, so I went to seek it outside our marriage. And it didn't even end well because it took the only man who had shown me true love. A week passed, and I had not spoken to Martin. Surprisingly, he came over to the house and told me that he had ran an investigation regarding our child because he looked nothing like him. So during his investigation, he found the most shocking things, and he had thought I would come clean to save our marriage. But my silence and lies showed that I didn't appreciate and didn't care whether our marriage was ending or not. That time, my heart and conscience had told me that I had lost my man because of a lie, and I slightly cheated because he was no longer paying any attention to me. What shocked me the most was when he opened his laptop and showed me the pictures of me and Martin at the hotel when we went on a weekend getaway. My mouth went dry, my heart beating outside my ribcage. There was nothing to even deny there because all the evidence of the affair was there. As I was still in awe about that, he took out an envelope that had paternity results. I don't even know when he had took them, but I guess he did. So he asked me to open them and read out loud what had been written on the paper. I did as he told me, but the way it was so hard to do that, I wished the earth would just open and swallow me. He was very angry to a point that he had a vein coming out of his forehead, On the other hand, I was busy crying and apologizing for everything, but I knew that my apologies were not going to change anything. It was like the more I cried, the more I was fueling his anger. I was increasing his rage to a scale that I would never wish to see ever again. I tried begging him, even kneeling in front of him like he was my god, but instead of shouting or at least slapping me, he just told me that I would regret the day our paths even came across, which really puzzled me and left me scared of the outcome of everything. He told me that he wanted nothing to do with me and I should expect divorce papers in a few days. Months later, I was going through a very rough time. I was depressed, swimming in regrets and sorrows. I wished I had done things a different way. My husband had left me with nothing but a house. I didn't know where to start picking up the pieces of myself and move on. George had also filed for full custody of a child, so I had nothing and no one to be left with. It really hurt a lot, but because I had let everything upon myself, there was nothing else to do rather than trying to move on and become the better person. Not for myself only, but for my child. Because George had won the full custody case, because I had been drowning myself in alcohol and didn't have time for my child. I was devastated by the breakup, but I knew that it was time to pick up the pieces of myself and try to fix them. I had to move on and find happiness on my own terms. I started therapy to work through my feelings and to learn how to love myself again. So as I navigated my journey of healing, I realized that I had been living a life that was not true to myself. I had been trying to fit into a mold that society and my husband had created for me, and I had lost myself in the process. With the help of my therapist and my newfound self-awareness, I started to rediscover my passions and interests. I started taking art classes, joined a book club, and even started a new business. I was finally living the life I had wanted, and I felt empowered and free. As time passed, I bumped into Martin, and to my surprise, I didn't feel any sort of emotions or anything. So we greeted each other, and he asked me to join him as he was going to grab something to eat. Our conversation was solid and civil. He then told me that he was heartbroken by the breakup and what had happened to our marriage, but he eventually realized that he had been just as responsible for the demise of our marriage. He had been so caught up in his career that he had neglected me. He started therapy to work through his own issues. I was really happy that he had finally realized that I was not the only problem in our marriage. As much as I had done the most cruel and unforgivable thing that ended our marriage, but he was actually the cause of everything. He was the root of my behavior. Yes, I should not be condoning what I had done, and I regret it every day. But the circumstances that I was facing had led me to resort to cheating. I was not going to seek attention and affection outside our marriage if Martin was giving me enough time, like how he was giving his friends and associates. He made me feel less important, and like I was his second best. His friends and associates came first, to a point that he preferred spending more time with them than his own wife. I would sometimes ask myself why he married me, if he wanted to make me a furnisher of the house and not give me any attention, because that was how I felt, like I was an object or a home security guard. But despite everything that had been done, I finally managed to forgive myself and forgive Martin also. I also managed to get fair custody of my child, and that was the most refreshing and happy moment for me. Martin and I both found happiness on our own terms. We learned that true love and connection require effort and commitment. One thing I vowed to embrace was getting a second chance with my child and be the best mother to him. So as I had told my story, please tell me if what I did to my husband was worth it, or the way I dealt with my husband's absence was good. I don't even know what I should have done to prevent everything, but what is done right. Please help me with techniques of moving forward in case I find love again, so that I would not repeat the same mistake as that I did.